Welcome, everyone, diving right into this deep dive into the world of immigration reform.
Always a hot topic.
Definitely. And this time we're zeroing in on a couple of bipartisan bills that have been making some waves.
Oh, bipartisan. That's always interesting to see in this area.
It is. So we've got the Dignity Act, first introduced back in May of 2023, I believe.
Okay.
And then more recently, the American Families United Act. That one popped up again in March of this year, 2025. Both are spearheaded by, folks from across the aisle. Representatives Maria Elvira Salazar from Florida, she's a Republican, and Veronica Escobar from Texas on the Democrat side.
Right.
What we're trying to do today is really unpack what these bills are all about, what their goals are, how they actually work, and what they could potentially mean for the future of immigration here in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, looking at these bills, it's clear they're trying to tackle a lot of the complexities and I guess the kind of acknowledged brokenness of the current system.
Yeah, I mean, starting with the Dignity Act, one thing that jumps out is the sheer number of co-sponsors it had right out of the gate. You've got folks like Representatives Gonzalez Colon, Schulten, Chavez-Derimer, Manning, Lawler, and they represent both parties.
Okay.
Which to me suggests there's at least some agreement that things need to change.
Makes sense. I mean, finding common ground on this issue is, it's a big deal.
Definitely. And if we look at the core principles behind the Dignity Act, it seems like they're trying to cover a lot of bases. They talk about stopping illegal immigration, right?
Right.
But then also finding, a dignified way to deal with the folks who are undocumented and already here. Then there's the whole focus on the American workforce and economy.
Yeah. How's that fit in?
And finally, ensuring the U.S. stays, prosperous and competitive on the global stage. It's a pretty ambitious agenda.
It sounds like it.
And when you read some of the statements from these representatives, you really get a sense of, why they're pushing for this. Representative Salazar, for example, talks about, the frustration that a lot of Americans feel. She talks about, people are suffering, the country feels divided, and that we need solutions that treat everyone with dignity, whether it's immigrants or border agents or businesses or, the American people who rightfully want to know that the borders are secure.
She's painting a vivid picture for sure.
She is. And then you have Representative Escobar, and she echoes a lot of that sentiment. She really hits on the humanitarian aspect of this, the strain on federal agencies, the impact on communities, and of course, the difficult situation of, the migrants themselves.
It's a multi-layered problem.
Absolutely. And she sees the Dignity Act as a way to, to inject some humanity back into the equation. But it's not just those two, right? You have a Representative Gonzalez Colon who acknowledges that immigrants have always contributed to this country, but also points out that illegal immigration has been a problem for decades and we haven't really been able to fix it.
Right.
Then you have Representative Schulten, who comes from an immigration law background, and she talks about how these piecemeal policies we have now are they're causing real harm to families, to communities. She even calls it a national security threat, an economic crisis, a humanitarian emergency, really emphasizing how serious the stakes are.
And I imagine the other representatives, they have their own perspectives too.
They do. Representative Chavez-Derimer, she really stresses the importance of border security, but also a compassionate approach. Representative Manning, another immigration attorney, she focuses on how crucial it is to have a workforce that can meet the demands of the economy. And then there's Representative Lawler, who actually has a personal connection to this. She shares a story about, firsthand experience with the broken immigration system and how desperately we need to work together, both sides, to find solutions. So there's definitely a diverse range of views, but they all seem to agree that something needs to be done.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, so let's dig into the nitty-gritty of the Dignity Act. Let's start with how it deals with the large number of undocumented individuals already living in the U.S. What's the plan there?
Well, they're proposing a two-tiered approach. The first part is this thing called the Dignity Program. It's a 7-year program, and it's specifically for undocumented folks who have been living in the U.S. for more than 5 years.
Okay.
So right away, they're not talking about everyone. There are some restrictions.
Right. And those who are eligible, they would get work authorization, which is obviously a big deal.
Yeah.
But they would also be required to pay basically restitution, a total of $5,000 over those 7 years.
Okay, so it's not just, a free pass.
Right. There are conditions. They also have to maintain a clean record, pass a background check, pay any taxes or debts they owe. They have to check in with Homeland Security every couple of years. And importantly, they wouldn't be eligible for federal means-tested benefits during that 7-year period.
Meaning, things like SNF, food stamps, or Medicaid.
Exactly. Those kinds of programs where eligibility is based on income.
Okay, so there's a lot on the table for those who participate. Now, what happens after they complete those 7 years?
So that's where the second tier comes in. There are two options at that point. The first is something called dignity status. It's basically a renewable 5-year status that allows them to continue working and traveling. But, and this is key, they wouldn't be eligible for citizenship, and they still wouldn't have access to those federal means-tested benefits.
Okay, so it's a kind of in-between status.
Right. Now, the second option is called the redemption program, and this is an additional 5 years, only available after completing the dignity program.
Okay.
This one is about pursuing a path to citizenship. It requires proficiency in English, knowledge of U.S. civics, and either community service or an additional $5,000 in restitution.
So it's a tougher road, but it leads to, the possibility of full citizenship.
Right, but it's important to emphasize that they'd still have to wait in line, so to speak. They'd go to the back of the queue for a green card behind everyone else who's already applying legally.
Right, so even if they meet all these requirements, it's not immediate.
No, it's a long game.
Okay, that gives us a sense of how the Dignity Act approaches the existing undocumented population. But of course, any conversation about immigration has to include border security, and this bill is no exception.
Yeah, no, it's front and center in the Dignity Act. They're talking about a massive investment, $25 billion, specifically for beefing up border security.
Wow, that's a lot of money.
It is.
Yeah.
And a big chunk of that is going towards this nationwide mandate for E-Verify. Basically, they want to make sure every single employer is using it to check that their employees are authorized to work in the U.S.
So closing that loophole, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. On top of that, they want to develop a comprehensive strategy for the southern border. They're talking about building more barriers, using more advanced technology, and putting a lot more boots on the ground. More Border Patrol agents, more CBP officers, more intelligence personnel.
So they're really hitting it from all sides: technology, infrastructure, manpower.
Absolutely. But it's not just about keeping people out. It's also about targeting the criminal element.
Right, the cartels and trafficking networks.
Exactly. They're proposing new ways to track the spotters who work for these cartels, tougher penalties for human trafficking, especially child sex trafficking. They even want to give Homeland Security the power to designate certain groups as criminal street gangs, which would make it a lot harder for anyone involved with those gangs to get into the U.S., or if they're already here, it would make it easier to deport them.
So trying to take a bite out of that organized crime element?
Yep. And it goes even further. They want to officially label the Mexican cartels as special transnational criminal organizations, which would have a whole other set of implications. They also want to implement biometric exit systems at all ports of entry, use DNA testing to verify family relationships in some cases, beef up security at the ports themselves with more advanced tech, and make it easier for legitimate businesses to operate across the border.
It's a lot to take in, but it sounds like a very thorough approach to border security. Now, let's move on to the asylum system. This is an area where there's often a lot of disagreement, so it's interesting to see what the Dignity Act proposes.
Yeah, for sure. So they're basically overhauling the system, focusing on two main things: speeding up the process and ending catch and release.
Okay, how do they plan to do that?
The biggest change is this idea of humanitarian campuses, at least 5 of them, all along the southern border.
So kind of like processing centers.
Sort of. The idea is that when families or individuals arrive at the border, they'd be processed immediately and then stay within these campuses while their asylum claims are being reviewed.
And they'd be, free to move around within the campus.
That's the idea. They'd also have access to services like medical care and legal counsel.
Okay, that makes sense.
Now, here's the ambitious part. They're aiming to make a decision on each asylum case within 60 days.
60 days? That's pretty fast.
It is. The initial interview to determine if they have a credible fear of persecution, that would happen within 15 days of arrival, and then a final decision within 45 days after that.
And what about complicated cases?
Well, for those, they'd be referred to a case management system, and they'd have to wait for a hearing before an immigration judge, so those would take longer.
Makes sense. But that 60-day target is pretty aggressive.
It is. And they're not just focused on changes here in the U.S., they also want to set up 5 more immigration processing centers in Latin America.
Oh, interesting. Why there?
The idea is to offer pre-screening and other services to try and discourage people from making the dangerous journey north, and to disrupt those large migrant caravans we've been seeing. They also want to work on a security and development strategy for Central America, really tackle the root causes of migration.
Okay, so trying to address things on both ends of the journey.
Exactly. And of course, they're also focusing on going after the criminals who exploit migrants, the traffickers. They want to crack down on fraudulent asylum claims with tougher penalties. And they're proposing this new two-strike policy.
Two-strike policy, what's that about?
Basically, if someone tries to cross the border illegally twice, they face much harsher consequences. The goal is to deter people from just trying over and over again, without a legitimate claim.
Right, trying to separate those who are genuinely fleeing persecution from those who are just, trying to game the system.
Exactly. But of course, how this policy would actually be implemented is, it's going to be crucial. They need to make sure they're not turning away people who genuinely need protection.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Now, shifting gears a bit, we talked about how the Dignity Act is focused on, treating everyone with dignity, but it also seems to have a strong emphasis on the American workforce.
It does. They're creating this new thing called the American Worker Fund.
Okay, tell me more about that.
So this fund would be entirely financed by those restitution payments we talked about, the ones made by people in both the Dignity Program and the Redemption Program.
Okay, interesting.
The goal is to use that money to provide job training, skills development, and educational opportunities for American workers who are unemployed.
So they're trying to directly link, the new immigration programs with support for the American workforce.
Exactly. Their target is that for every person in the Dignity Program, their restitution payments should help train or retrain at least one American worker.
Wow, that's a pretty specific goal.
It is. They do this through grants to support various workforce development programs, really focusing on getting Americans the skills they need for jobs that are in high demand.
That's a really fascinating concept. Now, what about specific industries? We hear a lot about the need for workers in agriculture, for example. Does the Dignity Act address that?
It does, and it's pretty detailed. They want to make it easier to get an H-2A visa, which is for seasonal agricultural workers.
Okay.
But they also want to create a more stable year-round workforce, so they're proposing to get rid of the seasonal limitation on the H-2A program. They also want to address rising food prices, which they argue are partly due to labor shortages. So they're proposing changes to the adverse effect wage rate formula, the AEWR. It's a bit complicated, but basically they want to set a new wage standard that's, at least 125% of the federal minimum wage or the state or local minimum wage, whichever is higher.
Okay, so trying to find a balance between protecting workers and keeping food affordable.
Right. They also want to allow agricultural workers to enter the country in stages, expand eligibility for the H-2A program to cover more types of agricultural jobs, and they're even creating a new program called the Certified Agricultural Workers Program, or CAW.
What's that one about?
It's designed to offer a path to legal permanent residency for undocumented agricultural workers who have a certain amount of experience and meet some other criteria. They're also looking at reforming the H-2B visa program, which is for non-agricultural seasonal workers, by incorporating parts of the Returning Worker Exception Act and streamlining the application process.
Wow, it sounds like they're really trying to cover all the bases when it comes to the agricultural workforce.
They are. They know it's a vital sector, and they're trying to address the specific challenges it faces.
Now, before we move on to the American Families United Act, let's touch on legal immigration. Does the Dignity Act propose any changes to the existing system?
It does. It actually includes quite a few provisions aimed at modernizing the system and dealing with the huge backlogs that have built up over the years.
Okay, like what?
Well, first off, they're committing to significantly reducing the backlog for people who've been waiting for a green card for 10 years or more.
That's a long time.
It is. They also want to raise the per-country cap on visas, which would benefit people from countries like India and China, where the wait times are really long.
Interesting.
They want to make it easier for people with STEM PhDs from U.S. universities to get O visas, which are for those with extraordinary ability or achievement.
Okay.
And they're proposing changes to the way employment visas are counted, so that only the principal applicant counts towards the annual cap. This would free up more visas for highly skilled workers.
Gotcha. Anything else?
They also want to include the H-4 Work Authorization Act, which would allow spouses of H-1B visa holders to work. And they're actually incorporating the entire American Families United Act, which we'll talk about next.
Right, that one's a standalone bill too.
Yes. On top of that, they're proposing a new 90-day visitor visa. visa specifically for families. They want to protect kids who might age out of visa eligibility because of processing delays, make students on OPT pay FICA taxes, change F visas to allow for dual intent, which means you could apply for a student visa even if you have the intention of immigrating permanently later on. And they want to create a new position called the Immigration Agency Coordinator to oversee everything.
Wow, that's a lot of changes. Sounds like a pretty major overhaul.
It is. They also want to pump more resources into the relevant government agencies to speed up visa processing and make the whole system more efficient.
Makes sense. Now, all of this sounds pretty expensive. How does the Dignity Act propose to pay for all of these changes?
That's an important question. And they're very clear that they don't want to use taxpayer money.
Okay, so how do they plan to fund it?
They've got two main sources of funding. The first is what they're calling an immigration infrastructure levy. It's basically a 1.5% tax on the wages of anyone who gets work authorization through the Dignity program.
So those who benefit from the program would be contributing to its costs.
Exactly. The second source of funding is for the American Worker Fund, and that's going to be financed entirely by those restitution payments from the Dignity and Redemption programs.
So it's kind of a self-funding system.
That's the idea. They're trying to shift the financial burden away from taxpayers and onto those who are directly benefiting from the new programs.
Okay, that's a pretty clear picture of how the Dignity Act works. Now let's switch gears and talk about the American Families United Act. This one seems to have a more specific focus.
It does. It's all about helping U.S. citizens reunite with their immediate family members, specifically spouses and children who have complicated immigration situations.
So it's really about keeping families together.
Exactly. And the key here is this thing called discretionary authority, which they're giving to immigration judges and officers.
Okay, can you break that down for me?
Sure. Basically, it means that these judges and officers can use their judgment on a case-by-case basis when it comes to spouses and children of U.S. citizens.
So they have more flexibility.
Right. They're trying to prevent families from being separated because of, some technicality in the law or some past immigration issue that might not even be the fault of the person applying.
I see.
They understand that the current system can be really rigid, and it can sometimes lead to really unfair outcomes.
Yeah, that makes sense. And we actually have quotes from both Representative Salazar and Representative Escobar about this act, right?
Yeah, we do. Representative Salazar stresses that the whole point of the American Families United Act is to benefit U.S. citizens. It's about keeping families together while still upholding the rule of law. She sees it as a way to protect American families.
Okay. And what about Representative Escobar?
She talks about how the current laws can be really cruel, especially when they prevent undocumented spouses and children of American citizens from getting legal protection. She sees this act as a way to restore legal pathways for these families to get their status sorted out.
So both of them are coming at it from the perspective of protecting families.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that there are a lot of families in this situation. The research shows that over 2.6 million Americans live in mixed-status families.
That's a lot of people.
It is. And even though U.S. citizens can sponsor their spouses and children for green cards, there are all sorts of rules and requirements that can trip people up. Sometimes it's something minor, something that happened a long time ago, or something that wasn't even their fault, but it can still prevent them from getting legal status.
So this act is trying to address those situations.
Exactly. It gives immigration officials the power to look at each case individually and decide if it makes sense to waive certain penalties or requirements. And when they're making that decision, they're specifically told to consider whether denying the application would cause extreme hardship to the American spouse, child, or parent.
So it's about taking into account the human cost of these decisions.
Right. They're trying to make the system more compassionate and flexible.
Now, are there any limits to this discretionary authority? I mean, can they just waive anything for anyone?
No, it's not a free-for-all. They specifically say that this doesn't apply to people with criminal records or those who are considered a threat to national security.
Okay, so there are safeguards in place.
Yes.
Yeah.
The focus is on cases where the main obstacle to legal status is a past immigration violation or some other technicality, not something serious like a crime or a terrorism concern.
So it's about giving a second chance to those who deserve it while still protecting the country.
Right. It's about finding that balance.
And it's worth noting that the American Families United Act has been introduced before, and it's also part of the larger Dignity Act.
You're right. It shows that there's consistent support for this idea from both sides of the aisle. You do understand that families shouldn't be torn apart because of bureaucratic hurdles, especially when there's no threat to public safety.
It really speaks to the human side of this issue. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into these two bills, it's clear that both the Dignity Act and the American Families United Act are serious attempts to grapple with the complexities of immigration. The Dignity Act is this sweeping piece of legislation trying to reform just about everything from border security to asylum to legal immigration.
It's incredibly comprehensive.
It is. And then you have the American Families United Act, which is more focused, but it addresses this really crucial issue of family unity. It's about recognizing that families are at the heart of this debate.
And it's about protecting the rights of American citizens.
Exactly. And for our listeners out there, especially the advocacy attorneys who are working on the front lines of this issue, understanding these bills is crucial. We're part of the Justice Pro network, and our whole mission is to equip you with the knowledge and resources you need to make a real difference for your clients.
And these bills, if they become law, they're going to have a huge impact on the people you represent.
Absolutely. So I urge you to really dig into these proposals, think about how they could affect your clients both positively and negatively, and continue to be strong advocates for those who are navigating the often confusing and overwhelming world of immigration law. You play a vital role in ensuring that everyone is treated fairly and humanely.
It's about making sure everyone's voice is heard, especially those who are most vulnerable.
Exactly. And with that, we come to the end of our deep dive. Thank you all for joining us on this journey through these complex but incredibly important pieces of legislation. Keep learning, keep advocating, and let's continue to work towards a more just and compassionate immigration system for everyone.